Good afternoon, everyone, future industrial psychologists, and welcome to the second installment of a career in industrial psychology for all the students in terms of this webinar. We've got a very nice line up for you today, and I would like to just introduce you to all our speakers for today. Firstly up, we've got JP van Zittert. JP is a registered industrial psychologist at the Health Profession Council. He's a senior manager OD and talent at the SA Taxi, also the managing director at SIOPSA Coaching, and he's got a vast experience in coaching, organizational development, change management, and talent management. And he will be speaking to you guys about some of the shortcomings and some of the subfields in industrial psychology. So JP, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today, and welcome. So secondly, we've got Ayadu. She is from the director of the Africa Careers Network at African Leadership Academy. She's also a registered industrial psychologist, and her main interest is in the development in coaching of people. And she has been working a lot with universities that help students to actually become work ready, that transition from being a university student to the world of work out there. So Ayadu, thank you very much for being here this morning. Then also we've got Fiona Martin. She's an industrial psychologist, thought leader. She's a senior manager in talent management. Her interest lies in career, talent, and leadership development. She's shared a lot of her expertise on various platforms. For example, some of ENCA news work, for example, magazines, and then also radio shows, just to name but a few. And she's also very much involved with career guidance. She's also have her own website, and then also recently launched her own YouTube channel in which she gives career guidance advice. You guys can definitely go and check that out. And then fourth, but not least, we've got Avi, and he's also a registered industrial psychologist. He's an innovator and a strategist, and he's also the founder and the director of Project 6 Innovations. And he's got a passion for both industrial psychology and strategic innovation. So to the panelists, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. And I think you guys will definitely benefit from what they will be telling us this afternoon. So first up, we've got JP. So JP, you are welcome to share your slides. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, you can.
Just give me a quick raise your hands if you can hear me. There we go. Love that. Okay, some participation in the show. Okay, so I'm going to quickly share my screen here. Thank you, Marissa, for the intro. And just going to get also going. There we go. Okay, here we go. So just from my side, I'm going to speak from my own experience and what I've learned over the years. And the key things that I wanted to just talk about is kind of my perspective of IOP, coming from an intervention specialist. So my job on a daily basis working in OD specializes on how do we identify initiatives that work in the business and that is implementable across different levels in the business. So I think the key thing that I wanted to touch on was to say, okay, what in IOP, what's good and what's missing? And I kind of see where's the gap that I see industrial psychs having to move in a bit more to make more of an impact. And then also IOP working in different industries and different businesses, saying what's it like working in those different industries and what can you kind of see happening in those different industries. And I just use this image to say, oh, the places you'll go as industrial psych was quite funny to me, because there's a lot of places you'll go with industrial psych if you apply your mind. So I think IOP, the good and the missing. I think there's so much that as an industrial psychologist you can do in a business. And from an industrial psych perspective, the day-to-day kind of stuff that we do and we get involved in is kind of around how does a business work, improving management, employee testing and selection from development and selection, training and development design, looking at work styles and how people work, improving workplace productivity, overseeing analysis and research and data collection. And as an IOP, you should be intuitive, highly organized, a critical thinker, and a problem solver. And I think with this, it kind of exposes you to a lot of fields to go into. From organizational effectiveness to research to working with employee experience, from assessments, and just basically applying those psychological principles into the different areas within the business and understanding their context. But I do feel that as an IOP, one of the key things that we should get involved in more, which is a gap, is working within strategy. I think a lot of IOP, and I'm not talking about human capital strategy, I'm talking about business strategy. I think a lot of IOPs are involved in the implementation and the design of human capital strategy and how we implement it in the business. But I think there's a big opportunity for us in how we understand the human brain and how it works in the workplace, to how we apply that within our strategy design of our businesses. I think there's a lot to be learned for IOPs around scenario planning and strategy design, that we, as with our psychology background and skill set, we can really make a significant impact into how businesses design their strategies. And then one of the questions that I found quite interesting that was asked was about what subfield of IOP is seen as the best. And I don't think necessarily there's anything that's specifically best, but I think there's a couple of fields that are very exciting. And I know Avi will touch on some of that a bit later in the webinar, but I think one of the key fields that I see that is very exciting is the introduction and the ability of employees to work with technology and Industry 4.0 and all the changes that we're seeing. I think there's a very, very exciting field there that we can apply our psychological understanding of the human mind and behavior into how we can support businesses into understanding how to get people to work with technology effectively. And I think the key focus there is not about technology replacing people, but how do we incorporate technology into the workplace where people can work with it and adapt it and adopt it into the way they work. There's a lot happening in this space. And I think just expanding your mind bigger than just assessments and what that space holds, and actually how we can apply the underlying psychological principles to this space, I think is a very exciting space. And just expanding your own knowledge of technology and the digital field as a whole. But I think the key focus for me is IOP as a strategic catalyst. I think coming into the workplace and having understanding of how the human brain works and how we apply it, I think we can really effectively work in how we help the business prepare their strategies, how we help the business explore the various options, and how our underlying biases start affecting how we look at these possibilities, and the team dynamics and individual dynamics that come into play here, and the psychodynamics that we need to help businesses understand, and then also helping them collaborate and design the strategy and implementing of it and the execution of it, and guiding them through those learning loops to help them understand, how do the people see the strategy, how do they apply it, how do they work with it, and how do we support them from a change management perspective, as well as from a employee perspective, and applying and driving that strategy into the business. So I think that's one of the key fields that I feel is as an IOP we can move into a lot more. So I think that's one of the key questions that I wanted to address. The next one for me was looking at working in different businesses. So this is not specific to industries. I think there's key challenges to working in different businesses, and how do I approach that as an IOP given the knowledge that I have, and how do I make sure that I'm effective? So I'm going to touch lightly on each of these type of jobs, and just say what the benefits are with each one, and what is kind of the risks that I need to mitigate as an IOP going into this environment. Doesn't mean that this is uniform across all businesses or that it's always going to be this way, but I think from my experience working across these different industries and this different business types, there's key things we need to look at. So just to show you my journey where I started, I went straight from varsity into a very small, not small, but relatively small startup consulting firm, industrial psych focused, very specific, working with assessments, leadership development, helping businesses understand how do we select the right people, competency frameworks, and the whole spectrum of it. So I worked in a small startup consulting firm, and then from there I kind of progressed and understood how to engage with my clients, how to work with them to understand what their demands are, and then I kind of moved into like a small medium corporate. My reasoning behind that was to say, as a consultant, I need to understand the other side of the equation. I need to understand business and how that works. So I wanted to be incorporated into a business and do the day-to-day kind of things to understand how the implementation actually gets executed. So then from there, I kind of got the opportunity to progress my career into a large corporate global consulting firm. I worked then in the consulting firm, and that actually opened up my frame of reference of what an IOP can work on. And it expanded it a lot more into strategy and operating models and the way the business works, and really seeing how we can apply our skill set that we have specifically in our industry into these areas. And then from there, I kind of moved to where I am now, moving into a space where you heading up a division, you are seen as the kind of expert in that space, and you have to design and understand interventions at different levels across different type of employee groups. So I've worked across the different spectrum of how businesses work. And I think the key thing for me was to say, okay, if I'm going into consulting, for instance, the benefits about consulting is firstly, it's very dynamic learning environment. You learn a lot very quickly. You advance rapidly. Your advancement's up to you. The harder you work, the more you get involved, the more you progress. You also get broad access to a lot of businesses, a lot of different businesses, different sizes, and you can see how things work. Then also creating and sharing. There's a culture of creating and sharing, and I think a key thing for us with this is to say that, you know, even though it's a very competitive environment, I think there's a need to share around delivering to the client, and you build a very big network. I think you build a very diverse network of not just IOPs but other people as well. Then I think what from a key risk perspective that you need to manage in this area, if you're going into this area, is firstly, because you're working across different businesses, and not a lot of consulting firms work with implementation. They work a lot with the client to design and put together. There is a risk that you might not develop as granular level information that you could working in a corporate on the day-to-day kind of things. But that can be managed if you are aware of it. Intense performance culture and highly stressful environment. It is expected to be a high performer at all times if you're working in these type of environments. And if you like that environment, that's good. It can motivate you. If you don't, it can be a bit challenging, but it is something you can manage. Then there is a possibility of poor work-life balance working in a consulting firm. You are away from home a lot of times, at a client site for months at end, weeks at end, maybe coming back weekends if possible. So if you are up for travel, then that's a good thing. If you're not, that can be something you need to manage and be aware of. And then the last one was about that broad knowledge can be beneficial, but it is also something that you need to manage. So I need to make sure I get to all the different things that I want to get and learn about. The next one that I wanted to discuss was large corporate. I think you get involved in a lot of granular stuff in a corporate, and you get to all the nitty-gritty type of things that you want to learn. It's normally a very stable environment. You know what's happening on a day-to-day basis. You can control your work. It's structured. It's audit. You have work stability and security. A lot of things are happening recently with COVID, and within a large corporate, you have a certain degree of stability and security to a certain extent. Risks, again, with a space, potential of being pigeonholed. You get put into one specific role and that's all you do. You don't get too much exposure. There can potentially be less room for creativity, not necessarily always, but they can, because it's such a big organization. There's a large and very detailed process to go through before you can implement and run with anything. And that's just from a risk mitigation perspective. There's time for action. It can be a bit slower than with a smaller company because there's a lot of approvals and consultation that needs to go through. Then hard to get ahead. It can be hard because you're working in an organization with structures that, depending on what the structure looks like, you'll need to wait for people to move. If that is your career progression and career kind of viewpoint that you want to move up into the structures. And then the last one is about, it can get to a point where it's analysis paralysis working in a big corporation. There's a lot of information flows, there's a lot of data, there's a lot of things to consider in a big corporate, and that is something that you need to manage if you're going into that space. The next one, small company, startup, benefits. You become a jack of all, master of none. You work across everything, you get involved in everything. Things happen relatively faster in a smaller company. There's a lot of opportunity to get involved in things, freedom to experiment, especially from industrial psych. If I want to implement initiatives, run with it, there's a bit more freedom. But with any environment, I think there's a bit of a risk here. I think the one risk is you can have significant change to the way you work on a daily basis, which can be a bit frustrating to certain individuals, but others like that. So I think it's up to you as an individual. Advancement isn't easy, and it might sound a bit weird, but I think because companies, startups are relatively small, advancement's up to you in terms of knowledge development, not necessarily progression. So I think that is something you need to be aware of. Potentially fewer resources, because smaller companies need to manage costs more effectively. You'll have to do a lot more with a lot less. Potential fewer benefits depending on the financial situation of the business. And then a little bit less job security. Smaller companies and startups can be potentially a bit more vulnerable to economic changes. So as you go into that space, just be aware of it. The last one I wanted to touch on is where I see a lot of IOPs going into is freelancing, doing your own thing, potentially own hours. And I'll get to that now in terms of risks. A lot of opportunity. You've got clients. If you've got a lot of clients, a lot of things you can work on, self-advancement, and then also more space for creativity. Risks, again, here that you need to be aware of. Significant changes to the way you work on a daily basis. Again, advancement depends on you because you're working for yourself. You need to go out and search for development. You need to go to drive your own development. Potentially fewer resources, because depending on the client that you're working for, one client would give you the resources that you need, another one won't. Fewer benefits potentially, because you're going to have to be making those tough decisions on what benefits do I want for myself or not. And potentially less job security and irregular income. Depending on how your projects come in, you might have a project for 6 months, or you might have a project for 3 weeks, and then you need to look for another one. So I think those are the kind of challenges. And then when we get to what's the kind of best way to go, I think you should be working in both, or potentially try and get into either consulting and then corporate consulting and then corporate. I think there's benefits to both. Depending on you as a person, as an IOP, what you're interested in, where you want to go, you might need to want to go into any of these. Just be aware of the benefits and kind of the challenges that you could potentially experience. Then different industries. Last one I wanted to touch on. I think from a mining and manufacturing, this is kind of my experience having worked in mining for a lot of years and consulting and mining in a lot of years. There's certain things that above the normal baseline that you need to be aware of. There's certain things that are a little bit different for each sector that could be nice for you and could be interesting, or could be, this is not something I'm interested in. And I think the key thing here is when you're looking at assessment specifically in a mining environment, it can be a bit challenging doing computer-based assessments in a mining environment, given that some of the individuals might not have actually seen computers before, not be computer literate. So that can show a bit of a challenge. Can potentially be a lot of travel. Depending on where you live, mine and interventions normally happen on the mining site. They're normally not in major cities, they're normally outskirts. And you're going to have to potentially travel a lot. That might be a nice thing or a bad thing. Early hours, Depending on what type of intervention you're going to be running as an IOP, if you want to work with people, you're going to have to be there before the shift starts at 6 o'clock in the morning, or before the night shift starts, or after a night shift. So I think it's very important to understand that those things you need to take into consideration. Also, production, and I think this is applicable in all environments, but I think it's very, very evident in mining that the production runs, shift runs. So if you want to run an intervention, you're going to have to work around it. As an industrial psych, assessments in a mine look a little bit different. On top of the normal stuff that you would do, you would also look at kind of safety related assessments, like psychomotor assessments. I've been many times down into a mine shaft, down to the bottom, assessing the working environment, looking at what's the demands on the individual from a psychological perspective, and how do we assess it correctly to make sure we get the right people to work in that environment. Then the next one is big focus on mines is operational effectiveness. So how do we get the mine to run more effective? Also, something very important that's not necessarily seen in all areas, but I think especially in the mining environment, is you need to understand kind of the different cultures, human migration, where people have moved from, how they've gotten to that space, what's their history, where do they come from, what's the impact on their behavior, what's the impact in terms of team dynamics. All that kind of has an impact to play when you're planning interventions in that space. There's unions to contest with. Unions normally in a mining environment are a bit more militant, a bit more aggressive, and it's something to be aware of when you're planning things in an environment. And then also when you're working with people on a mine, it's a lot about solving systemic issues within the mine than doing just nice show and tell kind of interventions. A lot of them will say, don't give me this cupcake, for instance, or a nice thing that you're doing, rather give me more pay, rather give me more things that I can take home, make my life better. So when you're planning interventions from a psychological perspective within the business and you're looking at how you're implementing it, those are key things to think about. A lot of companies in the mining industry have behavioral change specialists. Like, how do we change the behavior in the business, and how do I move that? And you're not always going to sit in the office. You're going to be working on the mine shaft, down underground, potentially open cast mines. I've been on a lot of open cast mines and conventional mines down the shaft. Cool experience. You might need to decide for yourself if you want to. Financial, insurance services, these are all industries I've worked across. Large scale implementation and all the challenges that come with that. Banks, 60,000, 70, 80,000 employees across different countries. Key focus with banks is a lot about employee experience. They're very competitive in terms of talent. Where do I find the right people? How do I increase my employee experience? Big focus on organizational effectiveness. Assessments above the normal things are more focused on integrity and reduction of risk within the environment. Because the HR functions are so big and mature, you can have work subdivided into smaller individuals, and you only work on a certain piece of it. Longer working hours potentially. You have to understand financials, so that's applicable to all businesses. But I think for especially in the financial sector, you have to have an understanding of financials if you want to work in that space. Then the next one is limited travel. Most of the banks are in cities. Depending on where you live, you don't need to travel that much unless you go to the branches. Second last one, government and public sector works a little bit slow, but more detailed in terms of how you approach your work. Big focus on basic efficiency and cost reduction. Normally assessments are outsourced within the government or public sector. Not always, but there's a big portion of that is done. Again, you need to have a good understanding of cultures, ethnicities, all that kind of stuff that plays into the space. If you are industrial psych into the public or government sector, normally your space that you will be working in as an assessment specialist, and how do we apply it within the space. Highly regulated in terms of the environment, and can be a lot of travel, I think. The last one, and this is my last slide for the day, transport and logistics. There's a lot of blue collar workers here, big company at the bottom, small at the top, a lot of people that are absent from the workforce. So you look at how do you do interventions that are absent from the workforce. And a highly fast-paced environment. There's a lot of moving pieces that are happening, but also highly regulated. So you need to understand, how do I move fast within an environment that can be a bit more regulated than normal, as an IOP, and all the normal regulations that we need to take into account. And normally there can be roles in transport and logistics that are very specific to that industry that's hard to find. And how do we support business from a talent and an IOP perspective to help them find and make sure we've got the right talent in the business. So I think that's it from me. I think I'm within time. And just to give you a little snapshot of current, what are the gaps, where can we go, where can we kind of expand ourselves into, what the different working environments could potentially hold, and also like looking at the different industries. And I didn't touch on all of them, there's a lot of industries, but kind of give you the main idea of the big ones. If there's any questions, I know there's a Q&A at the end, we'll address it then. I'm going to now hand over to Ayado, that will speak in terms of her space for the webinar. So thank you guys for the opportunity. Let me just, my video here. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Sorry for that, having a bit of connectivity challenges. Good afternoon to all of you. Thank you very much, Marisa, for this opportunity. Thank you, JP, for kind of prefacing some of the things that I'm going to talk about today. I'm hoping that you can hear me. I'm hoping that you can also see my screen. So what I'm going to talk about today is just focusing around a lot of the things that I do on my day-to-day. Like Marisa mentioned, one of the key things I do is prepare students for the world of work, and kind of giving them insights as to things to expect. So JP has given you a rundown of what the different industries look like, what the different pathways are. So I'm going to kind of run through that so that we're not repeating or saying the same thing over and over again. But my angle is focusing a lot on internships. My understanding is that there's a lot of students on this webinar, and I'm coming at it from the angle of things I wish I knew before I started my own internship a few years ago when I finished my master's. Some of the questions I'm going to be talking about or speaking through from the last webinar is talking through some elements of a successful or an industrial psychology internship, questions around, should I do corporate consulting, should I do an industry kind of consulting, or or consulting type of opportunities, what environments, what to expect in either environment. So JP has done a good job of highlighting what that looks like, the types of skills that you need to market yourself for consulting opportunities, and the type of experiences that are needed for you to be self-employed or to go the dependent consulting route. So maybe taking a step back and understanding what is the purpose of an internship, right? An internship is meant to build skills. An internship is meant to build knowledge or deepen your knowledge. You've kind of been doing your master's over the last few years, a couple of years, or even a year. How do you kind of transfer that knowledge? It's an opportunity to build mentoring kind of relationships, and my friend Fiona is going to talk about that shortly. It's an opportunity for you to practice, right? So convert theory to practice. It's an opportunity for you to gain, to use as a training platform, to kind of deepen expertise, to build networks, to identify professional mentors. I mentioned that. And the truth is, after all this, it's an also opportunity for you to build an understanding of what's expected of you to be able to pass your board exam for those who want to go that route. So just going into it real quick, there was a question that was asked in one of the that I received was, what are the key elements of an IOP internship? This is very much South Africa facing. So if there's anyone on the call who's not in South Africa, just bear with us. So it's very much tailored around what exists within South Africa. There's a form on the Health Professions Council website. It's called the HPCSA form 218, if I remember correctly. Apologies for that. And that form ideally highlights the different elements of what an industrial psychology internship looks like, the different things you need to focus on. So for example, the first 4 things on this list are where you need to spend majority of your time. The internship is meant for you to build and deepen your knowledge. Over the last few years or a year or months, you've been sitting in a classroom and being lectured and receiving a lot of information as regards to org psychology, personnel psychology, career psychology, well-being or wellness, testing and assessment. There's a lot of conversations that we have around professional ethics. There's different electives that exist, anything to do with ergonomics or consumer psychology. There's different elements that there's a lot of information that you've received. And so the internship is meant to help you think about how do you apply this knowledge, or what does this knowledge look like practically when you go into the world of work. The internship also, truthfully, gives you insights in some of the jargon that's used. JP in his presentation was using a lot of business-related jargon. And I remember before I did my internship, some of those things were maybe at the back of my mind, but I did not know how much I didn't know until I went to do my internship. And I was exposed to so much, and it kind of creates a thread as to understand what the world of business is and how to kind of apply the psychological principles to that. I know my colleague Avi is going to talk about this later on as regards to what IOPs should do and some of the things that they should not do. And I know in some aspects, some people think that IOPs should only be doing HR stuff. Very, very far from that. One of the key things that we should be doing is to demonstrate our ability to assess, to diagnose, and to design interventions that are applied to the individual, to the group, and to the organization. So based on that specific aspect, I think one of the reasons why I put that definition was for you to be able to think about the fact that in every organization, in every industry, there are human beings, and there are elements of interventions that are required. What are those things? And how do you kind of transfer your knowledge as regards to what am I learning in a class, and how does that apply within the world of work? And who do I need to ask those questions? So that's how I view an internship. So I kind of spoke about environments. I know also JP spoke about those. There are 2 environments that I found very interesting that many did not ask, or I did not see featuring within the questions. And those 2, I think, are government and academia. There's a lot of knowledge, and I think the expectation and the narrative is I finish my master's and I'm going to do an internship, and I'll either go the corporate industry route, so I'll either go to like your Nedbanks or Anglo-American type of environments, or I'll go to maybe the big 4 in terms of consulting. So those are very well known, and there's a lot of work that's done. Please note the typical jobs that I've put on the right on this table are not exhaustive. And it doesn't mean that because I work in government that my work is only recruitment. It's just a flavor of what to expect in the different environments. But the thing is, I think I saw a question just before I started my session was, how do I make myself marketable? One of the things I usually tell the students that I work with is not narrowing your idea of the only place where you could get exposure, right? So everybody, yes, will go into the industry, everybody into the corporates, everybody will want to go into the consulting route. One of the things that JP mentioned that's really, really important is the smaller businesses, right? The SMMEs, they have a need for talent. They have a need for interventions. They have a need for IOP kind of support and interventions and, tools that we use. They have a need there. And there's not a lot of players within that space, not that I know of. This is personal opinion. What about the government, right? There's a lot of opportunity within the government as regards to interventions. Also in academia, right? So I think the reason why I put this here is kind of to broaden your understanding and kind of thinking around where else can I get the exposure? Where else can I get the education that I need? Where else can I get to identify the mentors that could help me succeed professionally within my career as the years go by? And it's an entry point, right? It doesn't mean that when you get into this environment that you're stuck there. It's about what is the entry? What do I do when I'm in this environment? And how am I successful? And how am I adding value to the different places that I find myself? For today's discussion, very briefly, because a lot has been touched on that, I'm going to talk about corporate and consulting. And this is generally what my sense is. So one of the things, when I did my internship, I did it mainly in a consulting space within the Big Four here in South Africa, but I was also very privileged to work in the HR space of this organization. So I had like a hybrid kind of experience whereby I would go focus some interventions which are within the corporate space or within this kind of environment. So it's very specific as regards to our clientele or our clients who are internal, right? So industrial psych, a lot of our work is working with people. It's about viewing yourself around, are my clients internal or are my clients external, right? So for consulting, a lot of our clients were external across multiple and diverse teams. I think one of the things that really stands out for me in terms of experiences, and I will never forget this, is that we were designing an operating model for one of the mining companies, and I got the opportunity to go down a mining shaft just to understand what the employees would feel like as we're designing their job specs and just doing some type of job design for them. And for me, that really stood out because you're kind of putting yourself in the environment of the people in whom you're designing interventions for. And that's what the consulting world is. I got to work with many, like so many different people, diverse teams, different levels of skills, not just IOP, it was engineers you get to work with, people who are interested in tech. So the consulting space is really exciting. It's not always easy or explicit as regards to applying your IOP theory and practice. So you kind of need to always know thyself and have people like mentors, and Fiona is going to talk about that quite a bit, but have people who are kind of guiding you through making sure that you're remaining in your lane, so to speak, not necessarily not doing what is not meant, you're not meant to do, but how do you stay within the confines of industrial psych, but also adding value to the different environments that you find yourself. So that's very much the consulting type. And then within the corporate space, you get to work a lot on strategic projects, very visible and impactful projects, and you're able to see these projects to the end and measure them. I think that's one of the things that I kind of missed within the consulting space is we would go and design interventions, but we would not be party most of the time to implementing the interventions and therefore being able to measure them and do all sorts of things. And within the corporate space, there's opportunity to manage aspects of a project and be held accountable and have ownership around some of the deliverables that exist. The same also applies within the consulting space. And I would actually say within the consulting space, and I think when JP was giving his journey, the story of how he has progressed in his career, he spoke about how his expertise is within mining and within a specific aspect of industrial psych. So that is really exciting, and there's a lot of opportunity to do that. But so I know he said that there's an opportunity to be pigeonholed within the corporate space. I think the opposite is true, whereby in the consulting space, it's very easy to be like the expert in finance and the expert in change management in finance, and you kind of get attached to different projects in that aspect. So those are the kinds of environments and what to expect within, as regards to internships within these two environments. So a couple of things to think about. One of the questions that was asked as well is, how do I position myself for consulting? So the way I approached this was, how do you position yourself just period for opportunities? How do you think about what are the skill sets that make me stand out, right? There are many people looking for internships, not just industrial psychology internships. What are some of the things that make you stand out as an IOP intern within an organization? How do you demonstrate the value? What are some of the things employers say that they are finding desirable as regards to what they go looking for in a candidate, right? So some of the things are written communication. And I remember during my master's, there was a lot of writing. And during that point, because you have such a heavy workload, you're always asking yourself, when will this writing end? but the writing muscle is really, really important, because you're going to write assessment reports, you're going to write reports that will be presented to different clients, you're going to write your assessments and interventions and observations. So it's important for the reader to be able to understand what you're saying. The verbal communication is very important. You're going to be presenting things to people. How do you start practicing that while you're still in school? The critical and analytical thinking aspect is very important. Attention to detail, that cannot be underscored enough. That's really, really important, right? So it's not just your commas and your full stops, it's the whole plethora of everything that exists within attention to detail. Problem solving, that whole list, you can see the list on my screen. But how then do you demonstrate to an employer that you have been able to do this? So think of your application documents. And yes, I will go here because every day I receive applications for opportunities, and sometimes I want to cringe. It's important to position yourself, because by the time appropriately, the first time, right? Because by the time this employer or this person who's potentially going to recruit you is having a look at your application, they've looked at many others. They basically want to see the things that make you stand out. So for example, if you want to work within corporate environments, and this also applies to consulting, so there's a lot of synergies between the two. How can you show that you have the ability to work with people across diverse teams and across different levels? You ask yourself, great, so I'm in school, I'm potentially not I've not done an internship before, or I've not even had a job before, right? So I'm assuming that's where most of you are. What activities do you do in school? Do you belong to clubs? Have you been able to shepherd a group of people to facilitate some form of conversation? And the groups of people may be different from you. So it's basically, how are you able to collaborate with people across? And how are you able to tell that story in how you're presenting yourself, either during an interview or even during, like in your cover letter or in your CV? How can you demonstrate that you have worked independently? There are so many projects that exist within the masters, right? This project, the project I did with a group of women in the East Rand, where I was doing like an OD intervention for them. And that has opened many, many doors for me within my career so far, just talking about that experience and what impact it had to the different people. So just taking the projects and breaking them down and being able to tell your story and show that you are able to execute and deliver on results and deliver quality, right? And the consulting internships, there's a lot of thinking out of the box, especially during the interview stage. There's a lot of critical thinking, analytical thinking. You need to demonstrate that you think beyond what is presented to you. So for example, there's a lot that's happening in our world right now, and this applies to both, right? The pandemic is going to affect in a huge way the world of work. There's positives, there's negatives, right? Things around retrenchment. What role does an industrial psychologist play within a retrenchment space, both for the organization, for the group, and for the individual? What interventions do you put in place? How you're thinking about these things, and that the world is seeing that you're thinking about these things? There's so much conversation that happens on LinkedIn. Are you commenting? Are people seeing how you're able to write? Are people able to see your thought process and how you're able to contribute meaningfully to different discussions? So there's different angles of putting yourself out there. How are So start thinking about how you're engaging with your studies right now, preparing you for the world of work, both for the corporate and the consulting space, and how that will pivot you and elevate you into the next kind of aspect of your career, which is the internship. And finally, I think a big one to think about, and JP kind of touched on this, was there was a question around, how do I go independent if I don't want to be employed? So I'm hoping you can hear me, but okay, so how do you go independent if, for example, you want to be self-employed and you immediately after you finish your school? So one thing that I see is that the world sometimes can be very fickle. If you don't have any credibility and no backing, if there's nobody who can speak to your reputation as regards to executing and delivering quality projects, then it's very hard or difficult to get into that kind of environment where people are saying, come and run a project or do an intervention for my organization. How do you start building yourself up as a subject matter expert, right? How are you commenting? How are you putting yourself on networking, right? Who do you know as regards to maybe a mentor or a lecturer who is helping you, who is helping open doors for you, right? How are you showing that you have ability to work through ambiguity and uncertainty? I think one of the things a lot that happens within our work, and I know mine specifically, is there's clear paths as regards to certain aspects, but then there's other situations where you're forced to make decisions when you have very little information available to you, right? So it's very important to start thinking about those things and very early on in your career, and to collaborate with people across diverse projects. One thing I was thinking about when I was preparing for this was, there's so many opportunities to do that, especially now. All of us are in some form of lockdown or the other, but how are you collaborating with your peers, both at your university, but also across other institutions? What are some of the discussions you can have? Who within industry, the industrial psychology, for example, who are the industrial psychologists you want to pull into these discussions to contribute towards the thinking and understanding of some of the questions that you may have, almost similar to this setting and how it has been set up by SIOPSA on your end. Also thinking about the different skills. The big one that is not on this list, but I think is really, really important to kind of emphasize, is the ability to be a hustler, right? Be a hustler, the ability to sell, right? You need to sell ideas, you need to sell what product that you have. What are you the subject matter expert in, and how do you think the industry or the organization you're trying to pitch this to will benefit from that, right? So the verbal communication again, the critical thinking, engaging with everything that's happening around you, around the world of work, business, all sorts of things. It's very important for you to demonstrate that you're thinking critically about everything that's happening around you, and you're reacting, not just thinking about it, but you're reacting with solutions that people are actually looking for. What are the opportunities that exist around you, and how are you taking advantage of those? And how do people around you know that you're available to do the kinds of work that you say you're good at? So that's very much the idea of an independent consultant and working alone. But there's also very many opportunities to learn from other people who've gone before you, right? So in my slides earlier, the people who work within academia, one of the things they do is they contribute towards the research for different organizations. How are you learning from that person, whereby they'll be able to play within two environments, academia and the corporate world, and how they're able to create like a marriage almost of convenience, but where they're both benefiting, both the corporate and the academia, and ultimately the individual is contributing towards success of different aspects of success of an organization. Finally, key things to think about as you're looking for the internship. Don't be bogged down by the environment. For me, it's where is the opportunity? Where is the best place for you to build your skill set? And how do you go about pursuing that? And then always bring more to the table. I think one of the things that really irritates me is when everyone just says, but IOP is just HR. We need to show them the value of, we need to show industry, we need to show the world the value of IOP, so that when you're given a task to do, the question always is, okay, so what are the psychological principles I need to apply to doing my job? So that when people see, I'm always a cut above the rest. And finally, be indispensable. Always when you're doing your job or when you get into this internship, some of you may be doing your internships right now. What is that thing that people know you for? Are you tardy, or are you somebody who is dependable? Somebody who people know that if a task is given, so you will deliver it above and beyond, that you will deliver it within the timelines that are set before you, and that you will do it excellently. So I think that's the angle in which I wanted to come. I'm happy to take any questions, but that's mainly it. For now, I'm going to hand over to Fiona, who's going to talk about aspects of mentorship, but that's it from me. Thank you.
Fiona, you're welcome to share your slides.
Thanks, Marissa. I think I still need your permission to have my video on. It won't let me.
You are welcome. Yes, you can go.
There we go. Thank you. Okay, let me share my slides. Okay, there we go. Thank you so much for your patience. I think maybe just before I start, I'll just love to get, just with a show of hands, how many of you in this webinar have a mentor? Or maybe you had one before. Okay, so quite a number. Okay, I'm seeing quite a lot of numbers. Okay, so a good number of you, right? Okay, you can raise your hands back down. I want to see who's never had a mentor before. It hasn't even explored. Oh, okay, geez. Like my screen is actually lighting up. So thank you. So I mean, hopefully this session is going to be useful. What I'll do after this is, because I only have 25 minutes, I'm not going to cover comprehensively everything that I would have wanted to, but I'll certainly touch, I think, on key points that will hopefully be of use to you. I have a guide on my website, which I'll share with you, which is kind of a more detailed guideline that you can reflect on, that you can use thereafter in terms of, how do you go about approaching a mentor? So I think, I'm not going to introduce myself again. I think Marissa did a good job of that. Thank you so much, Marissa. So what is mentorship, and why should you actually consider having one? Why is it important? Does everyone need one? At what stage of our lives do we need one? So I'm kind of going to hopefully to touch on some of those elements. So I mean, just to define the parameters, right? A mentor is typically a relationship, between two people most of the time, which is based on a mutual desire for development. And I say mutual desire because usually your mentor is obviously, in the process to help you grow professionally and through other ways. And at the same time, you also have a desire or to work on some particular growth areas. And so hence that's, I think, in a nutshell, what mentorship is. Usually a mentor, right, is someone who imparts knowledge. So it is typically someone who knows more than you in that particular area that you want mentorship in. And I'll speak, to that, right? So does it have to be someone necessarily older? Well, not really, right? You might have a peer who is really, really excellent, within a particular area. Maybe they're really great at research, right? So they might be mentoring you just in terms of, how do you approach research? How do you do academics? So it's really someone who knows significantly more than you in the area that you're trying to develop, of which many times, I think, when you look at career-wise, it's typically someone who's a little bit more experienced than you, who's a little bit more knowledgeable than you, and of course, who's a deep expert in the thing that you're trying to do. Mentorship, I think for me, ideally, it's always a voluntary process, right? So it is where a more experienced person gives of their time, right? So I'm not really, look, maybe some of you have been in organizations or even maybe within your university where there's a mentoring program and you get paid up. So in as much as that is a structured program, there's usually a voluntariness, right? So I built a couple of mentorship programs, within the company that I work in, and very seldom we will force even a manager or a leader, to mentor people. So it's often a voluntary to say, look, if you have a heart for developing people, if you've got a passion of imparting your professional knowledge, please come forward. So that's how we always design it, because it really shouldn't be any case where I think especially the mentor is forced and also the mentee, right? So I'll give you an example. There's an opportunity where we're designing a program, and in fact, we had enough mentors to take everyone that was part of the population that we were targeting, but we still made them apply. Why? Because it might be something that you want, right? So sometimes I know a manager will say, hey, Fiona, I think you need to develop in this area, and this person would be great to mentor you. So they might suggest it, but ultimately it must be, willing buyer, willing seller type of thing, because even as a mentor, I don't want to waste my time with a mentee who doesn't want to be there, who doesn't feel that the process is worthwhile, right? So I think that's an important consideration, and you'll see why that matters as well. Now, what is mentorship not, right? Because I think, look, there's mentorship, there's coaching. I guess, for us in industrial psychology, there's counseling, there's career coaching. So, I'm not going to go into the details of the difference of those, but I think I'm going to speak more to you guys as people who aspire to have mentors, or maybe who might have an interest in mentorship, in getting yourself a mentor. So one, as a mentee, you are not passive in the mentoring process. So don't think you're there to sit with your mentor every week or whatever the frequency that you meet is, and kind of like just sit there and receive knowledge. You are an active part of the process. And what does that mean? It means you need to show up. You need to come to the party. If your mentor is giving you homework, if he gives you research, or he or she gives you research, you need to do that. And in fact, I'm not interested in mentoring anyone who is not as interested about their development as I am, right? Why should I invest my time and my energy when you're kind of lukewarm about it? And I'll speak to you in terms of why that is important as well. So you as the mentee are the one that drives, when I say drives the process, right? You make sure that, you get the value out of it, because sometimes a mentor will say, hey, I'm going to avail myself to you, right? But you tell me, how do you want us to work? What do you want from my side? So don't let your mentor do all the thinking. Yes, they've got probably significantly more knowledge than you, but they shouldn't be doing all the thinking in the process, right? You also have to be an active part of that learning journey, right? And I think for me, and even just when I speak to people who mentor and when we run these programs, that's always, what differentiates between kind of a mentee that is like lukewarm and, is just there, versus those. And I'll tell you as well why that is important. And also, look, so some people will think, well, I'm being mentored by this person. Maybe they've got a lot of power. Maybe it's the CEO of the company. Maybe it's the head of the division. Maybe they've got a really nice high-ranking position. So let me tell you, and this speaks to the voluntary nature of mentorship. You are not entitled, right? And I'm going to say this very, I think, clearly. You're not entitled to your mentor's networks, to any of the relationships that they have, to their resources. Maybe you run a business, right? And you need finances for your business. So their resources, their finance, their relationship, you're not entitled to any of that. So don't ever say, well, my mentor knows, the CEO of this company. How come he's not sending my CV there? Or, my mentor knows this person. Why is she not introducing me to that person on LinkedIn? So you're not entitled to any of that stuff. However, I will say, if you're a mentee that shows up, a mentor will have no problem whatsoever opening up the doors for you, right? I was in a mentoring workshop the other day where one of the leaders talked about how she got paired with a mentee that was, I think, a very high-ranking person in her organization. And his responsibility was to say, look, mentor this person for the next 12 months. But over and above that, he became a person that was like a sponsor, right? When a position would come up, he would even call, that person and say, hey, I've got this person, please look at their CV. So that is a byproduct of a good mentoring relationship based on a relationship that you have built, right? So don't think because I'm mentoring you, now you're entitled to say, send my CV here and there. And in fact, with many of my mentees, when we start the relationship, what I normally offer them is guidance, development, and all that stuff. Then where I see an opportunity to say, actually, I need to introduce this guy, I need to send his CV, I need to do this, then that almost comes because, of course, how I have evaluated the person. So if you want access to any of that stuff, you need to show up, because I promise you, people don't want to open up doors, right? Now, if I'm not sure about how you're going to, the kind of person that you are, right? Maybe you don't always show up at meetings, right? Maybe, I'm not really sure, you're not consistent, about with delivery or whatever. So I'm not going to put my name on the block and, set up a meeting with you or introduce you to someone important. Then you don't show up, or you're there and you're lukewarm. So remember, for someone to put their head on the block for you, they really need to be confident that actually this is a person I know, they will never humiliate me. If I say that this is a solid guy, right? This is a solid girl, I know that that's how you're going to show up in that particular situation. Because remember, I'm using my relationship now to introduce you to these. Similar, maybe you've got a mentor and you've got a business, you're starting a consulting firm. So they could introduce you, for example, to a potential new client, right? I will not introduce to a potential new client someone that I don't know is going to deliver, because I'm going to put in a word for them. So I think that's a very important thing to remember. But as I said, if you as a mentee show up, I promise you, mentors will not hesitate. They will move heaven and earth in some cases just to get you opportunities and to open up those doors. But that takes time. So don't expect it to be the immediate benefit. Sometimes it can even take a year just for you to have that solid relationship, especially if you didn't know each other, right? And for them to consistently see what your character looks like. So as an aspiring IOP, you might find that, okay, I want a mentor in the field of industrial psychology. How can this actually help me? What is it going to do for me, you know, right now as a student? Maybe you're a student that's working, maybe you're a full-time student. So what actually is it going to do for your career? I think first of all, you know, so you've heard some of my peers and you hear, you know, even with Avi talk, there's obviously different industry skills that we have, and we all come from different backgrounds. We've got different strengths, different areas of focus. So a very key one is to help you develop industry skills, right? So you might be interested in, hey, being an IOP in mining, or, you know, you're interested in consulting, you're interested in corporate, whatever that might look like, right? That's quite an important thing that a mentor, particularly in the IOP field, can do for you, because remember, they have a vast experience. They've been, you know, through the mill. So they'll be able to share with you what are the industry trends, where is the demand, you know, so all that inside information you can get from them. And one thing that I would encourage you to do if you've got a mentor, right? Because maybe sometimes you're like, well, how will I develop skills? Because I'm still at school, I'm not looking for a job. Maybe there's no opportunity for you to get a mentorship. Sorry, to get an internship, right? So often what I have done with mentees, particularly those, there was one, right? She was an industrial psychology student, but she was working. She had a full-time job, but in another completely different industry. So what I would often do is to put case studies. So if I was working on a project or working on something, I'd say, so we'll set up a session. I take her through what the framework is, what we're doing. I'll even sometimes make her do research and say, look, I need to roll out a project where I'm doing A, B, C. I need you to go research on this and come and tell me. So we'd actually even she would help me to brainstorm, research, and then I'll also give a feedback. Why did we go this way? I'd give her an opportunity, right? So we almost like worked on case studies on stuff that I was working on, just to kind of give her an insight of my thinking, how we do things, and of course, how it works in business. So that might be something that can help you to gain experience without obviously needing an internship, right? So your career goals as well. I mean, as you have seen, there are so many areas of industrial psychology, right? I mean, it's very vast. So you might not exactly know, where do I want to focus on, and that's okay. So don't put pressure on yourself to say, I need to graduate today and tomorrow I need to know which field of IOP. No, I'm sure many of my panelists here will tell you that it was probably through trial and error, and only after maybe a few years, 1 or 2 years of working, that you actually, you know what you want. And sometimes when you're on the outside, you think, oh, I love this area of industrial psychology, and you get there, then you find something else more exciting. So it's a transient process. It can change, and sometimes, you know, it can stay the same. So don't be so tight to have this very linear process. And also just life skills, right? So remember, a mentor will not only look at the technical part, you might actually have someone around, how do you build relationships, you know, and it might just be general life skills, you know, that they might support you with, especially as the relationship deepens as well. And, you know, as I mentioned earlier, just to access a variety of sources, networks, as you know, a high percentage of jobs are not advertised, right? There might maybe be many industrial psychology companies that you might not be aware of. So sometimes, you know, when someone reaches out to me, I'll say, have you checked out these companies? And they never actually even knew that those are companies that typically hire industrial psychologists. So they definitely can help you to say, well, actually, you know, SIOPSA is running this forum. Actually, this company takes interns. So it's just really, I think, providing information, you know, where they are able to sort of like support. Okay, then I think for many of you, I mean, if you're studying, it means you're going to be on the job market soon if you're not already. So they can really help you around, you know, is your CV positioning you in the best light? Obviously, introduce you to a couple of employers, refer your CV to a couple of employers. So there's many things I think around your job search, which is probably maybe the support that you would be looking for. And as I said, remember, you're not entitled to them, you know, introducing you if they don't feel the comfort to do so. But you'll find once you've built a relationship, they will probably reach out and be actively marketing you to their networks and to other IOPs as well. Okay, and I think for me, you know, the one thing, right? So I have a lot of people that approach me asking for mentorship, and I know that, you know, I guess for many other on this panel, I'm pretty sure they have the same experience. Now, I don't want to engage someone who doesn't know what they want. And when I say who doesn't know what they want, doesn't mean have it all figured out, right? Because as part of the mentorship process is us brainstorming, what do you want, right? But you need to have some clarity around why do you actually want a mentor, right? How is this going to be useful in your career right now? What will success look like? So Fiona, if you mentor me for a year, I'm hoping that I'll get ABC, right? And that's often key, because I think I've had, a lot of people, you know, sort of talk about how in some instances, I've heard people talk about how in some instances, you have a mentor approach it, they say, oh, please be my mentor. And there's something that's referred to as vanity mentorship. So maybe you like someone, you like the position that they're in, maybe they're very senior, you know, in the company or whatever, and you just want to be associated with them. Therefore you say, oh, please be my mentor, but you haven't thought through it. for those that have approached me, I always say, what are your mentoring goals? What do you want to achieve? And in fact, I even go a step further, and I always ask people to write down their mentorship plans, right? To say, if you want me to mentor you, please write down your mentorship plans. And then I can actually see if I'm the best person to assist you. Remember, just because I'm an IOP doesn't mean I know I'm the deep expert in everything IOP. So if someone comes and says, I need a mentor because I'm really interested in the field of OD, for example. OD is not my area of expertise. I know OD from a basic level, but I don't think I could mentor anyone. So I might then even refer you and say, actually, these are the people I know with OD experience, right? So it also helps me to screen myself to say, okay, these are your mentorship goals. Actually, these are my strengths. So I can help you with that. Or if I see that actually this is not something that I really have deep expertise in, normally I might refer to someone else. So that's very important. And it also helps me to screen how serious people are, right? So a lot of mentors will tell you right now that when you ask someone, right, why do you want mentorship? What is it that you're looking for? And then they kind of fumble. And I promise you, it's like a screening process, because probably like 80% of the people that I say, write down your mentoring goals and bring them back to me and let's talk, I never hear back from them. So for me, that actually helps me to see how serious you are about your own development, right? And I'm not going to chase anyone for their own development. You need to be more motivated than me to help you achieve. And for me, I will always reach out and impart as much as I can, but you must be equally motivated, because otherwise, I then have to wheelbarrow you around to achieve your own goals. So I think that's a very important thing. So in approaching a mentor, always have maybe what your areas are, and it's okay if they change, because maybe through your mentor you change directions, right? And that's the whole process. But just to approach them and to also demonstrate to the mentor that you have thought about what you want, and you kind of are not just on a whim asking them to invest their time, and the like. So I think for me, that's a very important process, particularly when you're considering very busy people, right? They probably get mentorship requests all the time. So they kind of want to almost test at the onset, how serious are you about this thing? And often when they see that you've actually thought it through, you've put together some plans, it really shows the level of investment and the level of seriousness that you have with this particular thing. Okay, so I guess a question would then be also, who is my ideal mentor? How do I even know? Is it Fiona? Is it Ayado? Is it Dr. Barnard? So I mean, how do you actually identify who your ideal mentor is? So think about it as if think about it as a job description, right? First of all, as I said, what are you looking for? Because you must have mentoring goals. So if your mentoring goal is, I love the field of consulting, I want someone to mentor me about the area of consulting, then you're starting to define it, right? I need someone who, is very good at this area, right? So because you kind of need to know, because remember, mentorship is not just general, like we just sit here, because otherwise you're not going to get value from it. Doesn't mean that if you sit with me every week and we just kind of like have random chats, you're not necessarily going to get value. And remember, your mentor is probably going to have limited time. So they want to know that the time they allocate is very well used. So define what it is that you're looking for, right? And another important thing as well is, and as I mentioned, what are your mentoring goals? So that booklet that I referred to, it actually has a template just to define your mentoring goals and just to get your memory jogging. So I'll post the link and you can download it, then it will help to show you. And often that's what I ask. When someone asks me for mentoring, I'll normally say, go get the booklet and actually put down using this template, unless maybe you've got your own personal development plan. So if you have a development plan that maybe you've done by yourself, you can actually present and say, hey, this is my development plan and this is the areas where I need mentorship. It also just gives you a good guideline. And then think about characteristics and qualities of your ideal candidate as well. So you might say someone who's an entrepreneur, someone who's got a mixed background of consulting and corporate, someone who's done ABC. So as you're thinking through it, it's almost like you're starting to define the qualities. It's like you're writing a job description, right? That's how you should approach it. And then once you have that identification, you can almost start to match people. So if you're going to be browsing through LinkedIn, you can say, okay, this one doesn't really seem to work much in the area that I want. This one hasn't done consulting at all. This one is more focused on this. This one is, so you actually almost, it helps you to kind of like screen against the requirements that you have put for yourself. And as I said, it's really more of a ballpark of what are you looking for, because when you approach a mentor, that is probably a question that they'll ask. What is it that you're looking for? And when you tell them, they often will tell you, okay, I can help you with this, or I can't help you with that. And also, look, mentorship ideally is where you want someone who exemplifies the behaviors or the qualities or the technical expertise that you want to develop, right? So it must be someone who ideally has excelled in the area that you have developed in. So I'm not saying someone who has just done good, is not good enough. Yes, they might very well be if you're looking for baseline skills, but ideally someone who has excelled, right? So that they can impart knowledge in terms of what was their process, how did their journey go about? And remember, even if you've got a mentor that you idolize and is someone that I guess is really exemplary, it doesn't mean you have to mimic them, right? So a mentor should not be someone who's trying to kind of develop a mini me, or so it's really them imparting their journey. Say, look, this is how I went about doing this. If it works for you, fine. But sometimes they generally give you gentle guidance around, actually, this is what worked for me. And sometimes it might not work for you. So don't feel compelled to say, I must be a replica, copy and paste of my mentor. No, they're sharing their knowledge, they're sharing their journey, they're sharing their lessons. Then of course you take those and you adapt, and you often work with your mentor almost like, in a give and take relationship, where you also contribute and say, look, I know you said this is how you did it, but I'm thinking of doing it a different way because, for whatever reasons, right? And then you kind of brainstorm to that. So don't feel like you must just accept and swallow everything that your mentor said because you don't want to offend them. It's actually meant to be a process where you're building this, together. So I've kind of come to the end, but I think the one thing that I wanted to sort of like mention, over and above that is, as I said, you need to show up as a mentee. And what does that mean? One, if you have appointments with them, you need to honor that. Don't think your mentorship meeting is the one thing that you can just easily cancel out of your calendar. I also encourage you that, when the person says yes and you have your first contracting, right? Don't be afraid to say these first 3 months, right? Or even the first 3 meetings is a chemistry session. So you call it a chemistry session, right? Because sometimes I might think Fiona is my ideal mentor. Then after about 2 or 3, I'm like, actually, I don't think, she's the ideal for me or whatever. It might not even be anything that is personal. Maybe the skills and the expertise you're looking for is not something that sits with me, right? So it's always okay at the beginning of the mentoring relationship to say, hi, Fiona, let's maybe do 3 sessions. At the end of 3 sessions, let's evaluate, is this working for us? Because I know there's a tendency for mentees, once they've reached out, they kind of feel like, oh, I feel bad to now all of a sudden say that, I don't want this anymore. It's not working out, right? So have that mature conversation. Don't just ghost your mentor and now you sort of disappear because you're afraid to have that conversation. So to make it easier for yourself is to say, after 3 meetings, let's evaluate, is this working for you? Is this working for me? And if it's not, that's okay, right? And then we can actually agree. And then I think a nice way to break it off, if you need to break off a mentoring relationship, is to talk about what worked. Say, look, even in the 3 sessions that we had, these are the things that I learned, right? And these are the things that I appreciated. But actually, I'm looking for someone who has a stronger consulting background. And I know that that's not an area you've been exposed to. And as I said, it's nothing really personal. And sometimes it's just the chemistry doesn't work. Maybe my work style and how you like to work is different. So it's okay to actually say, let's do a trial before we commit to like doing an entire year or 2 years, right? And I think before I close off, let me just look at my time, is also to look at situational mentoring. So you might find your ideal mentor is a person that doesn't have the time, right? So I promise you, if someone asked me right now to mentor them for a year, I'm most likely going to say no, because I don't have the time. I've reached my capacity of the number of people I can mentor, right? And also because when I get into that mentoring relationship, I want to make sure that I'm able to give the person adequate time towards their development. However, there's something that's called situational mentoring. Situational mentoring is maybe Fiona or Ayado or Dr. Barnard or whatever can't mentor you for an entire year, but they can mentor you through a particular situation. So what I have found useful, right, and I've actually done it in my life where it's like, okay, I don't think this person has got time to commit to a full-time mentoring relationship, but a situational mentorship is to say, hi, so-and-so, I'm trying to navigate this in my career. All I ask is just 1 hour. All I ask, if I think of the situational mentorship session I had, I think we probably had 2 formal discussions, then I think we kind of had more informal ones over chat. But I was able to achieve my goals through that, right? Because it was just a situation, I needed to navigate a particular situation. I didn't need him to mentor me for like the next 5 or 10 years, right? I needed to navigate a particular situation. So through those 2 sessions, he was able to give me really nice suggestions, really nice direction. And then it kind of went, we obviously still talk, we liaise here and there, we're connected on LinkedIn and the like. But yeah, I think for me, that is kind of like what is key to remember, that it's not an all for nothing. So if someone says, look, I don't have time for mentorship, then you can say, look, can I just have an hour? And I've done it with many people where I've just given them an hour. And then, a year or so later, they come back and they say, thank you for that conversation. You were able to plant some seeds or give me directions, which kind of like, were able to sort of like help me. So I think, yeah, that's what I want to say. That was my segment. I don't know, Marissa, if we, so I've kind of used up the time that I had. I don't know if we take questions now or if we're going to move on to Avi before we take questions. And thank you so much. So I'll put the link to the booklet in there.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Yes, we're definitely going to move on to Avi at this stage, and then we will have our Q&As at the end of the session. Thank you so much, Fiona. Avi, you're welcome to share your slides.
Perfect. Thank you. I'm just let me just call it up. Perfect. So can everyone see my slides? Or you can raise hands just for an indication. Awesome. Cool. Okay, not everyone at once. Right. So cool. Thank you guys for joining the session. And I think what's really important about these sessions is that you guys are the future of the field, and a lot of the questions or concerns that you guys have are concerns and questions that we ourselves as practitioners have as well. So part of some of the questions that emerged from the previous session is, how do we reinvent ourselves as industrial psychologists to remain relevant in the field? And then also, how do we see the role of industrial psychology changing over time? And I think in order for us to answer that question, we kind of need to frame a context in which we can do that. And I often have the discussion with people, and that context is, what is our identity as industrial psychologists? A lot of the time, and a lot of my colleagues that spoke before me, give diverse interpretations of what we are and what we do, but they're also grounded in the correct definition of us being human behavioral specialists. I think as an industry, for a long time, we've kind of shied away from that definition, or we kind of allow that definition to be evolved into how we practice our skills within organizations. So, just to address those discussions, and I'm going to try for this not to be a history lesson, but when we talk industrial psychology and when we talk relevance, I think it's important for us to remember where we came from, and to always understand that first and foremost, we are psychologists. Looking back at the history, I think where we start and where the initial discussion always sits is in that philosophical space, in that what does the mind do? How do we understand the mind? How do we understand people and behavior? And throughout the historic journey of psychology and the development of psychology, that has been one consistent theme. As much as we have different faculties of how this was practiced in the form of structuralism, functionalism, and moving forward, the common thread again is behavior and understanding behavior and the human mind from that. I think what's important for us to remember as industrial psychologists is, if you can see on the screen, the little divergence in behaviorism and kind of that in-between spot between behaviorism, Gestalt, humanists, and the kind of initial development of intelligence testing. And that's where you kind of find industrial psychologists being placed, in that World War I came around and we kind of realized, okay, we need to, how do we kind of put the right type of people in the right positions to perform and function in certain ways that gives us the best efficiency and effectivism. So we have Taylor, we have Mayo, and then we have the key critical moment, which I think in industrial psychology is the Hawthorne studies, where it was the kind of the first and initial space where we said, as professionals, as scientists, let us understand human behavior, let us understand group dynamics, and how do we then translate this into a field and into something practical that we can use along the way. And I think that's the kind of context I think that we always need to frame the discussion of relevance when we discuss industrial psychology. And and that's where we kind of find ourselves in today. So I'm going to kind of leave the screen on while I speak to where we're at and kind of where we're going in the future. And I think the first kind of discussion that we always need to have is, number one, what is our identity within the field? Who are we as industrial psychologists? What do we do in the field that's unique and different to what other HR practitioners are doing? Majority of the time, the confusion sits with the fact that industrial psychologists tend to find themselves moving into the human capital space of organizations. And in doing that, kind of role transparency or a role, there seems to be a role merging of the two fields, and the two fields being industrial psychology and human capital. So the question has always been, and it's something that Marissa, part of SIOPSA, has been trying to drive for a while as well, is that how do we reclaim our identity as behavioral scientists? How do we make sure that the community at large, the industry out there, understands that first and foremost, as psychologists, we understand human behavior. We use our understanding of human behavior to drive interventions. And JP and Ayadu spoke a lot about this, and even Fiona as well in mentorship. How do we claim that unique spot in the space? How do we go into industry, if through the human capital space or even through the consulting space, and how do we claim that identity of saying, we understand behavior, but we also know how to utilize that understanding into interventions that you can help build, improve efficiency in the organization. So it kind of begs the question as to, do we return psychology or industrial psychology to the whole behaviorist piece, and play within the cognitive space? But it's kind of interesting discussions that we need to have. And what you find recently is that more and more industrial psychologists are opening up niche practices. And in those niche practices, they are starting to adopt a more psychology flavor in their business. And beyond that, when we look at then the foundation, and I think that's the reason I placed the history aspect as part of the discussion, is that psychology, first and foremost, industrial psychology as well, is that we are there as organizations to utilize psychological principles and teaching. And in doing that, we then have the expertise, we have the scientific knowledge, but we also have kind of that philosophical understanding of, this is an individual. An individual within that organization is going to perform in a certain way. And in their performance, you are going to then start seeing certain subconscious behaviors. You can start seeing certain behaviors that tend to kind of impact the process. And I know Fiona touched upon it in her mentoring discussion, in that when you mentor people, you kind of mentor them with the understanding that there's an end goal. And as industrial psychologists, you got to ask yourself, what is our end goal within this space or within an organization to have these type of discussions with organization? It goes beyond the whole discussion of, as HR practitioners, we implement policies, we implement advice and guidance, and we play within that well-being space. I kind of see industrial psychology, and based on my experience, is that there's a broader scope of practice that we can play with. I mean, we kind of have to return psychology, or return the way we use psychometrics, for example, to that original space of, what are we testing? Why are we testing certain constructs? And what do we then do with those certain constructs? I mean, SIOPSA, for example, they've created 2 subgroups in terms of the system psychodynamic subgroup, and then the neuroscience subgroup as well. So those discussions are being had in the field, and it's kind of saying, let's again take back psychology. Let's own the space within psychology again. And a lot of times organizations use psychometrics, and they use interventions as part of their recruitment process, and as also part of their talent management process. And what you often find is that there's a barrage of assessments that are being used in space, and you sometimes ask yourself, why am I using certain assessments? Am I using it because it's popular, or am I using it because it's actually giving me what I need and giving me what I want within the space? And I'm biased in this aspect, and I'll own that bias. But a lot of tools out there today, and a lot of tools that many organizations utilize, sits within that positive psychology framework. And again, it's a branch within psychology that speaks to an individual, that speaks to a person having certain positive traits and understanding those traits, and moving beyond that, and placing the individual as a holistic being as the center part of that conversation. But in doing that, we often find that we kind of leave out the other aspects of an individual, the kind of critical aspects that we as psychologists understand this individual to have, such as their cognitive ability, their values, their intentional drivers. So what are these core constructs that help a person move within the industry? And I think to frame the argument of how do we remain relevant over the next few years, or what do we bring to the field to make us relevant? And I think part of that discussion is gamification. And actually, I'll go as far as saying the whole discussion is gamification. In that gamification gives us the opportunity to do what I mentioned that we need to do. In that, one, we claim back our identity as industrial psychologists. And secondly, start utilizing true psychological principles once again in the form of methods that don't bias individuals. Most of you guys are students, so I'm sure you guys have read a lot on this, and that the reason psychometrics have such a bad name in the market is because of the difficulty, or because of the manner in which it was utilized pre-94, and then also the very populist approach that we have post-94. And the discussion is often always that we test people in languages that are not their first language. We test people around constructs that don't have the similar meaning in vernacular languages. And then we then assume that these individuals or these people all fall within a certain cluster or a certain type of type and environment fit. So this is where the argument comes in for gamification, and it's something that Marissa allowed us to present at SIOPSA last year as well on is, how do you shift the industry, or how do you get an industry to appreciate and utilize different technology? Because one of your questions in the last session, was how do we stay relevant with the fourth industrial revolution? I think JP touched on it as well, and it's about utilizing the skills and utilizing the innovative methodologies that we've often utilized in psychology. It's about taking back or claiming that space within psychology and saying, we have psychological constructs, we know organizations operate in a certain way, and how do we then cater for a market or utilize our skills in a space that people were traditionally isolated from? And when I say traditionally isolated, I mean majority of cognitive assessments, for example, would put people in certain buckets based on their backgrounds, and that caused a lot of confusion in the industry, or a lot of debate in the industry on how certain things were done. And the gamification discussion, or the relevance discussion, then places us again within these three confines of saying, one, identity is very important. Secondly, psychology as well. The root understanding of psychology is very important, and gamification as well. In that sense, kind of gives us the opportunity to explore these two aspects. I mean, there are individuals in the field right now that are fighting the good fights and trying to make this happen. And I mean, a lot of research that is currently being published by individuals like Callum McComb and Professor Francilius around the dark side of psychometrics. We often forget that in the recruitment process, when we recruit individuals, we put them through a battery of assessments, and then we kind of leave them either with just a 1-hour feedback, or we don't even provide feedback at all. And what that tends to do in the organization is you start bringing individuals unconscious to the fore, and you kind of leave these people within that space of battling themselves. You just gave them a whole suite of information on who they are, but they really don't have any scope beyond that on how to or what to do with that. And we find the same with gamification in that space. So we have the likes of Dr. Kincaid Kotze out there, who's created an amazing tool that looks at psychometrics, but from a pure psychological perspective. And it's the typical argument that people often have is, if only I could understand the back end of a gaming mindset. When I play a game, can I get all that information and understand that information and see exactly, the subconscious mind of an individual coming through? And with what Dr. Kincaid Kotze is working on, those are some of the potentials of where the market is going in the future. There are other industries out there or other companies out there, such, people like international companies like Revelian, for example. But again, I tend to be very biased in that as South African industrial psychologists, I think we need to start moving away from being so reliant on importing international tools for the space. I think this is the perfect opportunity right now to play within the aspect of, again, not to sound like a broken record, but to reclaim that identity of being psychologist, reutilize that skill and understanding of behavioral scientists. And you guys being the young entrants into the field, I think, this is something that you guys must try and push for us, because as much as we can argue it and we can argue for the relevance of industrial psychology, I think we need to own that identity first and foremost and not allow ourselves to, become cogs in the machine that is the corporate world, or even within the consulting space. I mean, like JP and Ayadu mentioned, and even Fiona, is that there's a perfect opportunity within the consulting space or that niche space for us to reclaim that identity and reclaim that that foundational psychology aspect. So yeah, I think that's where I want to leave it. I mean, if there are any questions, you guys are, I think we are going into a Q&A session right now with Dr. Bowers and the team. And then from there, we can always reach out beyond that as well.
Great, Avi, thank you very much for that, and looking into the future of IOP. And I think it's actually very exciting to see how many broad specialized fields there are, and how open this field of ours are as well. So I'm going to open up the floor if there's any questions from the audience of the attendees. So please raise your hand if you've got any questions. We do have a first question. Brandon de Jager, you just mentioned in the Q&A a question before, so you are welcome to voice your two questions that you have for a specific panelist if you would like.
Hi, yes. I don't have a specific panelist that I would like to address this to. I would just like to know that, for example, in Namibia, where we have a very small community of industrial psychologists, how would one go about finding a mentor or internship, or at least opportunities where you could learn and gain experience in the field? And then regarding the second question, where I think a lot of organizations in Namibia lack thorough leadership. And I think this is something that industrial psychologists could perhaps improve. But how does one go about improving leadership when you, I almost want to say, work under a specific leader?
Brandon, thank you very much for those two questions. I'm going to ask the panel if they have any advice. The first question about opportunities, specifically in Namibia. Maybe Fiona, will you be able to assist with that question? And the second question about leadership, Ayadu, will you be able to please maybe assist with that question? Fiona?
Unfortunately, I'm not actually familiar with I guess the laws and the regulations in Namibia, so I won't be able to advise there. But I guess maybe one question I can put to you is to say, is there a governing body, right? So I know that across Africa there's kind of disparities around the governance of the field of industrial psychology, right? So I don't know if that's something that is governed by either the Health Professions Council, maybe by another professional body. So I guess that would be your first point of call to see if there is one. I know some countries don't, and where it's more, I guess, professionals rallying upon each other. Yeah, so I'm not able to assist there, unfortunately.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Ayadu, the second question.
I'm not sure if I had the second question properly. Could you just repeat that?
Yes. Okay. So the second question is just regarding a lot of the issues with organizational behavior in Namibia is very, or let me rather say, it relates to leadership, to either poor leadership decisions, and so forth. And how would an industrial psychologist go about improving or helping the leaders improve their decisions?
That's a good question. So basically, you're talking about industrial psychology and influencing leaders and leadership generally. So there's different ways. So the first thing that comes to mind when you're talking about that is coaching, right? So I know there's all sorts of coaches in the world, but it's about, I mean, all around us doing all sorts of coaching courses and calling themselves accredited coaches. And this is not even shade I'm throwing to anyone, but it's about how are you able to guide that leader and make them aware of what they're right, for lack of a better word, and that's very fluid. What is the right leadership skills, so to speak? What is the right behavior of a leader? And what looks like the leadership journey? What does success look like for a leader who's leading an organization appropriately? And what are the desirable behaviors that somebody needs to kind of have in order for them to be successful in doing that? Because in some instances, I find that there's a lack of awareness. It's not malice or anything, there's a lack of awareness. So for you thinking about within the industrial psych framework, what do we say leadership development looks like? And how are you able to potentially try some of those interventions with one or two, depending on how much influence you have? I don't know how much influence you have, but kind of drive some of that change with one or two who are able to speak to your credibility and who are able to speak to some of your interventions. And also give yourself some leeway potentially to measure the impact, because the truth is you may not necessarily see the impact of your work instantly, but what are some of those things that you can, a menu of ideas that you can present to some of these leaders who are open-minded to, because there's a level of buy-in and influence that you may need to have within this space. So I'm not sure if that answers your question, but to the first question, I think jumping on to what Fiona said, there must be one or two or three or four industrial sites in Namibia. The question then is, what are they doing? How did they get to where they are? Are they interested in starting something? Because for me, I find that sometimes there's a need for a group of people just to come together and talk about what the needs are and take action. And slowly by slowly, you'll see a body forming, regulations existing, etc. It does take time, but I think looking back to who has come before you, what are they doing? What are their thoughts as regards to the industrial psychology ecosystem within Namibia? And how can you band together to kind of address some of the issues that you're seeing exist within, or gaps that exist within in Namibia?
Okay. So just, sorry, if I understand you correctly, with regard to leadership, so it's basically also assisting the leaders in what their goals would be for the organization, and then trying to sort of guide or influence, or not influence behavior, but rather guide behavior to achieve those goals.
Mm-hmm. So if you think of the presentation which JP gave as regards to the gaps that exist within IOP and contributing towards strategy, this seems like an opportunity to play within that environment and that space of influencing strategy and influencing behavior and contributing towards success of business through behavior. Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, I just wanna add something to that. Thank you, Ayado, for raising it. I think on the topic of leadership, I think because it's such a contextual, we have generic guidelines in terms of what a good leader is, but I think it's very contextual to, firstly, your culture in your business, as well as your kind of the employees in the business, and what the sub climate is in the business. And I think it's from looking from a leadership perspective, I think it's important to establish what a good leader is in your business, and from there looking at what those competencies are, and then looking at working with your leaders to help them understand the impact that those competencies have been on their space. So I think, without getting too much into jargon, I think it's very important to understand what a good leader looks like in your business, in your country, and then from there working to help your leaders to understand how they can develop self-insight to get there.
All right, fantastic. Thank you so much, guys.
Great, thank you very much, Ayadu, Fiona and JP for that insight. I have a question from our live YouTube channel. I'm going to ask that for Avi. And of course, all the other panelists can just jump in on this question. And the question comes from Nozipu Lepele, who asks, would you say IOP is a saturated field or industry? Avi, what would you say?
Hi, thanks for the question. Look, I wouldn't call it saturated. I think there's enough subfields within industrial psychology where people have carved out their niche based on psychological principles. I think what we do tend to find is that saturation potentially does come from our institutions and the amount of individuals that don't continue along or continue towards a professional qualification. At the end of the day, industrial psychology or even psychology is a professional qualification that requires you to do your master's, your internship, your board exam. But what you do tend to find is that many universities, and I'll use my university, for example, I started at UKZN in 2010, and I think we started off with a class of about 1,200 industrial psychologist undergraduate students, which then morphed into about 150 honors students, and then finally kind of about 16 master's students. So I think dilution does potentially come in that perspective, but I don't think the field industrial psychology itself is diluted. I hope that answers your question in a manner that's relevant.
Thank you very much, Avi. Of course, the other panelists are also welcome to jump in terms of that question. And I do agree with you, Avi, that it's definitely a professional degree, and we should also voice ourselves as professionals. We cannot compare ourselves with HR specialists or someone in the HR department. We are a professional degree, and of course, we've also registered like that as well. JP, would you like to add to that?
I think it's also, I think I saw a stat, I think it was a year ago or something, that there's less industrial psychologists, registered industrial psychologists than actuaries. And it just shows you that there's not a lot of industrial psychologists, qualified registered industrial psychologists in the field. I think the biggest challenge that we have is, like we've spoken about today, is actually distinguishing and creating the demand from businesses for industrial psychologists and actually showing the value that we can add. I think to a certain extent, there is a misconception around industrial psychology touching on human capital or HR, and kind of that's the field you fall in. And that kind of makes it feel like it's saturated. But I think if we can drive that distinguishing factor and create the demand that there is to show that it's actually a very specific skill set that we have, and there's not a lot of us that actually can create a big drive for us. I see a lot of companies moving towards employing more industrial psychologists because of the level of education and rigorous development that we've gone through to understand the employees within the organization, as well as understand business as a whole. So I think there is a shift that I'm seeing in business, that people are seeing the value that an industrial psych can bring to a business, and that people are turning more towards employing industrial psychs into certain roles than there was in the past. So I think we're making good progress in that space. I think it's just something that we need to continue to say that because of our rigorous qualification and the experience that we've gone through and the qualification that we have, we add a significant amount of value to the business when we are brought in.
Toby, thank you very much. I hope that answered Nozipo's question that's on the live YouTube link. Khonse, you indicated that you would like to ask a question. You're welcome just to unmute yourself and ask your question. Welcome.
Great, thank you. This has been very informative. I've enjoyed every minute. Avi mentioned, us creating our own tools in South Africa, which I think is so very important. And, I'm especially interested in tools that measure potential, because right now we are quite limited to educational backgrounds and experience as measures of suitability for roles. which I think is very constraining in the market that we're operating in South Africa. With the high unemployment rate, so we need to get people into jobs. So I think we really need to start measuring potential better. What are the panelists' views on that?
Jose, thank you very much for your question. Avi?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I mean, part of the discussion around that is, individuals that build psychometric tools in South Africa, we kind of joke about it as being a long lost skill within the industry, in that, generations previous to us kind of held the rigor and the interest and excitement in wanting to build these assessment tools. I think what we are finding in the industry, and JP and Ayadu, and even Fiona, I think you guys can assist here as well, is that JP mentioned in the mining sector, for example, it becomes difficult to assess individuals within that space because majority of them are typically blue collar individuals. But then the argument becomes, how do we as psychologists start creating non-verbal assessments? And when I say non-verbal assessments, is how do you assess people without language? How do you use images? How do you use processes that are beyond connotative languages, beyond connotative emotions, and look at the pure construct beyond that? So I think there's definitely a resurgence in rigor in the industry in terms of wanting to pursue this. The rest of the panelists, what do you guys think?
I just want to add that I think I saw, from my experience working in the mining industry for many years, I think that is so true of you that you raised in terms of moving to, using one example, language, like you moving towards language agnostic assessments that tap into the same constructs that we want to measure, but we don't use language at all in the assessment, which then allows the potential employee or employee to then exhibit that ability without having being limited by their mother language that they speak. I think there are a lot of assessments, not a lot of assessments, there are assessments that are being developed in that space that tap into those constructs from a non-verbal perspective. I do feel that, like Avi touched on, the history of assessments, that is something that we need to drive a lot more, is moving away from language specific assessments and context specific assessments, and more towards non-verbal reasoning tests. I think that can be very beneficial in terms of eliminating some of the biases that we are experiencing at the moment. And also, sorry, on the potential,
JP, are you still with us? I think we've lost you a bit there.
I think we lost JP. Look,
yeah.
JP, are you back?
JP, you're back.
I was just
sorry. No, what I wanted to say was there's a shift away to what is this person's potential in terms of their ability to learn in the future, and how can we help them get there? Then I focus on where they currently are and are they the right person now. There is a shift, and I've seen a lot of companies move towards that space where they're like, we would rather want to know what we can do with this person potentially than focusing on where they are at the moment.
Great, thank you so much, JP. So I see we are running out of time, and thank you very much for the questions that was raised in the live YouTube channel, as well as Q&As that was on this platform. So I would just like to ask any last new words of inspiration for our future industrial psychologists from the panel. Can we start there at JP? What would your last inspirational words be for our future industrial psychologists?
I think for myself is if focus on the base of what we've learned in terms of psychology, and then think about how do I apply that into the business. Don't get construed or limited by maybe just assessments or just talent, or just like think about how we can apply those principles that we've learned to assist businesses. And I think with the new generation coming in and into this world of technology, I think you guys are much better positioned to drive that technology integration, and I think leverage off of that, drive that and use it to your advantage.
Thank you very much, JP, for those words. Ayadu?
From my perspective, I think I'm more charged than I was earlier this morning. I think just from this conversation, just hearing the different panelists and the wonderful things that they're doing. An aspiring psychologist right now, I would say take the bull by the horns. There's so much opportunity out here in the world. Ask questions, use the internet, read up. There are so many more and more industrial psychologists becoming visible as regards to the work that they're doing. I think more than even in my time. Just grasp, learn, be hungry for knowledge, learn and apply. And before you decide to kind of specialize, try and learn as much as possible so that you're able to kind of, you have exposure in all environments and potentially all industries if possible. And I know jobs are hard to come by, but try as much as possible to just keep learning, keep the hunger, keep the fire burning, just keep learning. And don't forget to always give back. When you get into a job, always remember there's someone coming after you who would benefit from guidance from you. So just seize the moment.
Right, those are definitely wonderful words saying that there, Ayadu. Thank you so much. Fiona, any last words of inspiration from your side? Your mute, yes.
I'm going to say, I think the exact same thing I said at the end of the webinar last time, right? To say, as long as there are human beings in the workplace, and as long as us as industrial psychologists, we can show that we have superior knowledge of, human psychology, we will always be relevant. So I know the relevant question always comes up: are we relevant? Are the opportunities? Yes, we will only stop being relevant once, machines take over and there are no human beings. And I think, to what Ayado said, don't limit yourself to say, I think someone in the comments talked about searching for jobs just as industrial psychologists. There are so many ways that we can apply our skills. And as I said, just always position yourself as having superior knowledge around behaviors, around human interactions, because those are the things that are the most difficult to deal with in the workplace. And that's all.
Fiona, thank you so much for those words. Avi, last but not least, from your side?
Yeah, I think guys, just stay passionate. It's, in psychology and industrial psychology, it's one of those fields where it's, without sounding philosophical, it's a passion field. You got to enjoy what you're doing. You got to enjoy working with individuals, and you got to make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. And yeah, I think my last words of inspiration or advice is, the world is very diverse out there. To Fiona's point, as long as there's people, we are always going to be relevant. And who knows, we may one day be examining the AI psyche of a robot. So that could potentially be a potential avenue for us as well. Cool. All the best, guys.
Great. Thank you so much, Avi, for that. To the panelists, from my side, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. I think definitely benefit our future industrial psychologists. They always have a lot of questions and a lot of unsureties about the field. And I think it definitely brought them a little bit more closer to what is out there and what they can expect. So from my side, thank you so much. I really appreciated that you shared with us today. And yes, I hope our future industrial psychologists also enjoyed the session. And please take note that we will be definitely having a session somewhere in July as well. So have a look out for that, and we will definitely let you know regarding that free webinar for the students. So yes, from my side, thank you very much, panelists, Avi, Fiona, Ayadu, and JP. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise. And yes, everybody, please have a lovely weekend and take care and be safe. Thank you.
Thank you.